Welcome. Happy CDFA Healthy Soils Week. You are in a conversation on cover cropping in California's water-scarce environments with Emily Ayala with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, Tom Johnson with Seeds for Bees, Project Apis M, and Sarah Light with University of California Cooperative Extension. We are thrilled to host this live Q&A based on a conversation that we had late last week discussing strategies, benefits, and challenges of cover cropping in the California context. I am Sarah Castle. I'm a senior scientist at Sustainable Conservation. And if you aren't already familiar with our organization, we are a California-based, California-focused nonprofit organization with the mission of advancing the collaborative stewardship of California's land, air, and water for the benefit of nature and people. And this conversation is an extension of Sustainable Conservation's work at the soil-water intersection to really understand how improving soils can build more sustainable water supplies and protect water quality. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to share. So first, we'll play back the recorded conversation that we had. And then joining us today are Emily and Tom to help us answer some questions at the end of this recording. So feel free to pop any questions into the chat or the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time. And then we're recording this webinar today, and the webinar will be posted on our YouTube and then also circulated via Sustainable Conservation's blog. Okay, and so finally, I just want to share the QR code for the guidance document, Cover Cropping in California's Water-Scarce Environments. And this is the document that we'll be talking about some today. So we have that link in the chat. I guess we'll share the QR code with you soon. And I want to point out that there's a QR code actually within this document that also has a lot of the links that we'll be referring to of resources, websites, and things like that. All right, with that, we will play the recording. Emily, Sarah, Tom, thanks for joining us today to talk about cover crops and water. To kick off this conversation, can each of you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing around cover cropping? So Emily, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thanks Sustainable Conservation and CDFA for having me on today. My name's Emily Ayala. I work with Community Alliance with Family Farmers, and just some background, I went to college in the Central Valley for my undergrad and lived in the Modesto and Turlock areas for some years, working in the ag research and kind of nonprofit spaces, although I'm currently based up in Chico. And I've been with CAF since 2019, working with our ecological farming program. And so some of our work around cover cropping really has entailed, we've done a handful of on-farm demonstration trials, some of which have been in areas where I would say water is limited. And then we also do technical assistance, kind of helping growers dial in their cover crop practices. And also, yeah, one of the mainstays of our program is doing farmer to farmer kind of learning opportunities where growers can expand and share on their experiences with practices like cover cropping. Also have put together several resources around cover cropping. So for example, we have our decision-making guides. We have one that's oriented for perennial systems and one that's kind of around annual systems, cropping systems, I should say. And yeah, I think lastly, more recently kind of wrapped up a project that was around looking at motivators and barriers to adoption of orchard growers in the San Joaquin Valley. And yeah, just really talking to folks about what has worked for them, what some of the challenges have been. So having kind of in-depth conversations with a handful of farmers, specifically around cover cropping and also some other conservation practices.
Great. All really important work. Thanks for sharing those details, Emily. Sarah, we'll go to you.
Thank you so much for having me. My first experience was with cover crops was actually working on an urban farm in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from. And now I'm a farm advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I've done a lot of cover crop research and demonstration projects as part of my program here, including producing resources such as a cost study for the Sacramento Valley on what anticipated costs might be for incorporating cover crops in an annual rotation. I'm also the current president of the Western Cover Crops Council, which serves the 13 states in the West. And through that, I led the effort to add the West to a species selector tool, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, and which a lot of people in California participated in the data verification for. So,
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I'm looking forward to getting into the details of the selector tool. And Tom,
Th-
last but not least.
Well, thank you for having me. Basically, I just did some math here. I've been working in the agricultural industry in California for over 35 years now. I spent over 20 years working for a wholesale seed company that basically specialized in cover cropping, and I was the trial and demonstration guy. So I've done that a lot of observation and consultation for growers and their dealers up and down pretty much the whole state, from Kern County up through Tehama, including the Coast Range. So I've seen a lot of a lot of different reasons for cover cropping, and I've seen a lot of different cover crops utilized up and down the state. So some people say I know what I'm doing, but I'm not sure. But anyway,
Tom, you definitely came out and helped me plant some of my first cover crop trials when I first started at the UC.
yeah, no, I worked with the UC, I worked with CAF, I've worked with just about every operation there is out there right now. Right now, I am working for a nonprofit, the Project APISM Seeds for Bees program that provides cover crop seed to people that are want to apply and provide forage for honeybees and soil health all at the same time.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Well, needless to say, we are in great hands today in this conversation. I'm just really struck by the depth of all of your experiences around cover cropping. So I'm going to start us off with a little bit of background into, how we all came to working on this issue of cover crops and water. A couple years back, Sustainable Conservation, along with CDFA, UCANR, NRCS, and CARCD, kind of all the acronyms, convened a group of experts and researchers that culminated in a collaborative report called Cover Crops in the Era of Sigma. And this was a compilation of the recent research and science around cover crop and water use and water benefits, but then also some insights into how the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act could impact the adoption of cover crops. And all of you were a part of putting that report together. But Emily, you had the initial idea of pulling some grower specific highlights from that report into a guidance document. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit about why it's so important to have guidance around cover cropping and water scarcity, like we have in California.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and also just to note, I can't totally take credit for the idea. I think my colleague Sarah Tiffany, who's on our ecological farming team, she kind of posed that idea, and then I helped with the execution of, putting together this grower guidance. But I think that, looking at this from like a landscape kind of viewpoint in California agriculture and also from a climate resilience kind of standpoint, there's, as we know, all of these intense climate-related pressures that growers are having to contend with, and particularly drought and extreme weather events and extreme temperatures and whatnot. And so, to me, I think a big question that comes to mind is how can growers, withstand these pressures, but also how can soil health and cover crops play a role too? And then also kind of looking at the in terms of increasing groundwater regulations with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. That's another regulatory pressure that growers are having to figure out how to navigate and how to farm with less water in some cases, like in much of the Central Valley. So yeah, in terms of cover cropping, I would say we know that it builds soil organic matter. It helps with infiltration and water holding capacity. And so essentially just whatever rainfall you're getting or irrigation you're applying, being able to actually capture that and hold it in the soil is a really relevant benefit there. So I think cover crops like provide some great buffer in terms of and some extra resilience kind of in face of these different climate related pressures that folks are dealing with. So I think where this guidance comes into play specifically is that there's a lot of information out there around cover cropping, and I think it's kind of an area that's information saturated, in my opinion at least. And so we didn't know of a concise, like grower oriented guidance that puts together recommendations around, species selection, planting timing, termination timing, all these different management considerations. And yeah, I think those are the things that we look at in the guidance specifically. And then also I would emphasize that the way you cover crop is going to be context specific. And so as such, the guidance isn't saying like you have to do ABC, but it does outline some of these kind of key considerations and recommendations, with the key question being, how do I cover crop to, maximize agronomic benefits or soil health benefits, while also minimizing water use. So yeah, this guidance really aims to walk growers through that kind of decision process and management process. And I think also recognizing that like not everybody's going to come to maybe start cover cropping with water scarcity in mind necessarily, or even soil health benefits. Like oftentimes folks approach it from a management goal or trying to like solve a certain issue on their farm. And so just also, mentioning that that's also a valid way to approach cover cropping as well.
Great, thanks. And Sarah and Tom, you played a big role in the development of this guidance document, cover cropping in California's water scarce environments. And just also want to give a shout out to you and then the other contributors who also played a big role in that. Sarah or Tom, anything else you want to add to what Emily's already said?
Sure. I just to kind of briefly add a little bit, though Emily covered quite a lot of stuff there. Thanks, Emily. Is that, cover crops ultimately are supposed to provide benefits on the farm and not make things worse for your water budget down the road. So understanding those dynamics can help growers manage their cover crops and achieve the goals without that stress of having a negative impact on their soil water. I know some growers who will say that cover crops are a necessity for their operation, and that they know long-term they're holding more water in their soil, reducing irrigation, building soil structure, and having other non-water related benefits. But they make specific management decisions, particularly around termination, to conserve soil moisture for the next crop. So I think there's a lot of complexities there that are important to address.
Great, Tom.
Kind of what I wanted to point out mostly is in 25 years of doing trials up and down the state, and quite often having one in the South Valley and also one in the North Valley using the same things, wide differences that go on. But in 20 something years, about 2/3 of those years were years we experienced average or less than average rainfall. And successful cover crop users basically learn to roll with the punches.
Yeah, that is really important, thinking about that variability that can happen on a year-to-year basis with water. I think Emily used and Sarah, you started to get into it, but depending on how you do it, cover cropping can have many different benefits, from attracting beneficial insects to improving soil fertility. And there are also a number of water benefits, including increasing infiltration, protecting soils from runoff and erosion, just to name a few. And some of those things might be the goals of cover cropping in some instances. So what what is really important about prioritizing your goals with cover cropping? And can you share some examples of how that works? Tom, you want to kick us off with that question?
A lot of times when I was consulting on something like this, basically we first out asked what's the goal that you want to accomplish. Defining the goal of your cover crop program is going to help us determine what plants we're going to recommend, and also some of the management techniques that may go with that for either achieving that goal or making the best of what you've got out of there. So if your goal was I want to increase my water infiltration or we had sequester leftover fertility, you're going to look for something that's going to grow plants that grows a extensive root system real fast. That works real well in a dry situation because then you've accomplished both things at once type of thing, and you've also managed to maximize your biomass, which would be one of your goals maybe. If your goal is to augment your fertility, you're going to choose something that's either going to sequester what you've got left over or add to it. You may be using not legumes for that type of thing. If you're addressing erosion, you want something that's going to cover the soil real quick, make fibrous roots, or at least hold that ground in place a lot. So you might be trying to address more than one issue at a time, and there are some plants that can do that one thing, but they're not so good at something else. So that would be something we're going to go through as we're deciding what we want to do on this thing. The primary benefit of cover crop overall is just soil improvement in your field. And so if we put a cover crop out there, you protected the surface, you enhanced the soil's ability to breathe, take in water, exchange oxygen, et cetera, and you fed the soil biology, which is actually what's doing all the heavy lifting of moving that water out of the soil into your plants or moving your nutrients around. So doing a cover crop in general is just a benefit. It's just deciding which ones to use and how to manage them for your situation.
That's a big question. Sarah, I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts to add on this question of goals.
Sure, I absolutely agree with what Tom said. Cover crops are variable, so the expectation around what you can accomplish with them is also variable. Tom mentioned some great examples. I would say when you're picking a cover crop, it's really important to understand when you're terminating the cover crop so you know that the cover crop can achieve those goals in that window. If you're planting for pollinator, food, you have to make sure it's going to flower before you have to terminate it, for example, in an annual system. Or if you want to mine nitrogen, reduce leaching, and you're going to need something deep rooted. Increasing infiltration, you need to have plant canopy before the rain, that type of stuff. So understanding your system timing and goals can be really critical for success with picking cover crops, a mix or a single species, and really getting the most value added from that practice.
Yeah, and maybe I'm curious how you guys think about approaching multiple goals in cover cropping. Is there a way to think about how to achieve, Sarah, you just mentioned some kind of tension between different goals that a grower might have with pollination or other things. Is it a balance of trying to achieve all of those goals at the same time?
Yeah, I would say we have the cover crop species selector tool that was recently launched in the fall for the West, and it allows users to pick up to three goals. It does sort more heavily by goal one, but you can sort of see how different species perform for the three different goals. And so in that case, you would want to pick something that's performing pretty well for your three goals, or at least your top two goals. Certainly having a mix can help. I don't know, Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about mixes with that
Yeah, well,
in mind?
we'll dive. The thing with a mix, seed mix basically, is that yeah, we have a primary goal, and then we have a secondary goal, and we have a tertiary goal, and we have 20 different things we're trying to address here. Um, and that goal is going to change over time as your soil improves as well. But basically, so many of these plants that go into what we call a cover crop mix do several things and do them very well. So a lot of time, the guy, oh, we want better water infiltration, so we're going to plant triticale. We want something else. Triticale is going to be part of that thing. So they intertwine a little bit. A lot of times, a mix is also used as insurance. in these variable climates, variable soils that we have in California, um, the top of the field may be great, and the bottom of the field may have drowned it out if you didn't have a mix, if you planted just one thing out there and you didn't cover all of your soil, and you accomplished most of it, but maybe not all of it. So you would use a mix for that, and that magic word of diversity out there as well. Sometimes what's in that mix is also aimed towards pollinator forage or beneficial insect attraction or something like that. So it's not necessarily we're going to go out with one plant and fix the whole problem. We're usually going to use a blend so that we can address our primary thing, but we're also going to get some other benefits out of the whole thing. And yeah, the second choice on your list of plants to use is still going to make deep roots. It just does a little bit different, maybe.
I think through this, I'm hearing that, species selection is a really important decision, and it's really linked to your goals. And so you gave some examples of how different species perform different functions or how they help you achieve different goals. But when it comes down to selecting specific species, do you have any insights into how growers can best approach that individual species selection? Sarah, you mentioned the cover crop selection tool, which sounds like a great opportunity
Yeah.
to get at
Um,
that.
yeah, I'm happy to. I know the tools shared in the chat. It's also available on the Western Cover Crops Council website. It's a cover crop decision support tool as well as a database. And so users can go in and browse really robust information about species that they are interested in to learn about the way the species grows agronomically, planting information, seeding rates, termination information, reliable establishment windows, and from there can pick multiple species to put into a mix that will work together well for their multiple goals. A user can also select up to 3 goals, and then it'll auto-populate some information based on their location and some systems questions to select species that are recommended to that end. But I guess just to talk a little bit more about selection, aside from the selector tool, I'll just say that, I think when you're thinking about what to pick, of course, goals, as we've talked about, is very important, but it's also what comes next in your operation and your cash crop. I work in annual systems, so I'm always kind of focused on that. In perennial systems, I know you have the cash crop in the ground all the time, but from an annual crop perspective, knowing what next crop you're going into can be very important. Termination should definitely be a known quantity if possible to avoid stress in the spring. And so picking a cover crop that you can terminate no matter what, I think is really helpful because you don't know what the spring is gonna bring. You don't know if we're gonna have a wet spring or a dry spring, or in my area, sometimes we call it a March miracle if we've had it really dry and then everything dumps at once. So really being able to terminate that so you can get your cash crop in the ground is critical. And I always encourage people to work backwards from there with, start with the kind of the end in mind, because you're planting really in preparation for that moment at the end. And so really thinking about, how that's going to work in your operation can be really important.
Yeah, and if I could interject just quickly, a lot of times you're going to be offered a pre-made mix, might be a very good example. So having an idea what's in it and using the selector tool to at least get the attributes of those things that are listed in that mix is going to help you decide whether, yeah, I want to lean this way or I want to lean to something slightly different.
That's right. Yeah, and I think, picking, like if you have a really early plant date in the spring, picking a legume that'll break down really rapidly can be a good choice. If you're planting later, you might want to go for a cereal with higher C to N ratios, so there's more opportunity and more heat units for it to break down with. So it really just depends on your operation and what you're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks. You kind of led us into the next question, which is really around that termination piece. So, growers are balancing a lot of factors when they're thinking about how to maintain and whether or when to terminate cover crops. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those considerations, and maybe how it might look different in perennial and annual systems like you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I think in an annual system, you have often a tighter window because you're trying to have a plant back. But I would say cover crops are supposed to be a benefit and a value add, not a negative. So to that end, thinking about weeds can be very important. Managing the field to make sure that any obnoxious weeds you have don't spread. If you have weeds that are popping up, or you have a cover crop like a brassica in the mix that's going to flower and you don't want that to set seed and become a problem later on, doing a high mow above the canopy line to cut that seed head off can be really helpful, or that flower stalk, before it's a viable seed. So really, thinking about maintaining the cover crop as much as you need to prevent it from becoming a problem is important. I think in the middle of the season, it's exciting to go see what you see out there: earthworms, pollinators, how quickly your field drains compared to a neighboring field, for example, and having that satisfaction of just knowing that it's capturing water, it's infiltrating down, you're storing water deep in your own soil, and your cash crop will get that later is exciting. And then deciding when to terminate so that you're not stressed about planting, monitoring the weather, and terminating accordingly. So from a water perspective, if it's a really dry year, you want to maintain water in that root zone. So if it's a really dry year, you would probably want to terminate earlier. Some people terminate even in the end of February or early March, and then they might even have to pre-irrigate to break down that cover crop if it's too dry to get good digestion. You do want to get some breakdown so that you don't have really hot soil when you plant, because as microbes and insects and whatnot are feeding on that cover crop biomass, they also will feed on your transplant or seeded commodity in an annual system. So giving that time for digestion is important, and kind of terminating with that in mind. Really comes down to the weather from the water perspective. So in a normal year, you might terminate around the timing of your cash crop, give yourself 2 to 3 weeks for digestion, incorporation, and then plant into that. And in a wet year, a cover crop might help you dry down that field as it warms up, as it transpires water. But then, of course, that is sometimes of a concern in annual systems, is when people are worried about that time for digestion and it's a really wet year. So, but there is definitely a dry down, as it starts to warm up, the cover crops are using more and more water and helping to dry down that soil profile. So, I think those are some of the considerations. I could kind of continue to go on with the specifics of considerations for annual systems, but I know we don't have all day. But I will just say using a bed knife for termination can be really helpful, because the most important thing when you're terminating the cover crop is to make sure that that cover crop does die, and that you don't have any hidden weeds that are going to pop back up and be a problem for you later. And a bed knife will just kind of cut that root right off. You asked about the difference between annual and perennial systems. I mostly work in annual systems, so that's what I know about. In perennial systems, you have a little more flexibility there, but certainly, frost risk can be of concern. If that's at flowering, the cover crop can hold more moisture if you have a frost risk in a canopy. And so perennial growers still do need to kind of consider that. And, but also they have some more opportunities to maybe terminate later and capture all the water in a rainy season, or capture some water with dew in the winter, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And we also know there are perennial growers who we've seen who delay and extend the termination time out through the summer too. So it seems like maybe there's a lot more of flexibility or variability in terms of how that happens in perennial systems. But Tom, curious if, given all your work in perennial systems or in the valley, if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, and Sarah covered quite well the reasoning behind terminating in an annual system when you need to terminate type of thing. Although I've also heard, we were hoping it would dry it out and it didn't. So there is that potential. These are all beware of type of things, I guess. But it really boils down to what your cash crop is. And in perennial systems, that boils down to how much residue can you stand at harvest. If you're sweeping something up off of the soil surface, you can have some, and you have a very efficient harvesting machinery or system, you can live with a certain amount of residue, but that's a judgment call on your point. If you're going to pick it with a machine and you're going to catch it off the ground, or your grape harvester or whatever, leaving it stand out there for a while longer isn't going to hurt anything. Or if it's larger like walnuts or pecans or something like that, that are easier to sweep up. You still have to do some termination. You're still going to have to maintain that biomass or break that biomass down, type of thing. But you're going to have a little bit more leeway in a perennial system most of the time than you would have in an annual system. But you also have to realize that a vast majority of our perennial systems now are on drip systems. So we're essentially farming two climates. We have an irrigated crop and we have a dry land middle. So, in the case of trying to keep more water in the soil or have more water in percolate into the soil than we used up in our cover crop, that would also have something to do with when you're going to terminate, type of thing. In a year like this one, where it was warm and dry in March, people were out starting to mow it down earlier, so the rainfall, basically what they did get, isn't going to get pulled back up again. They're finding a lot of times that the infiltration rate overcomes the consumptive use by the cover crop, but we have to convince everybody of that. So, and then like I said, you have to get that biomass to break down so that you can deal with it at harvest. So it's either not, sticking up and everything else, type of thing. So that has a lot to do with um, timing, and what we're going to use.
Hmm.
So yeah, and yeah, you're going to go, a lot of times, yeah, that is something that you do have to remember. When am I going to harvest this thing, and how am I going to harvest it?
Hmm.
That drove a lot of what people used in cover cropping for a long time.
Hmm. Just want to add one more thing about water conservation with termination, which is the idea of rolling after you terminate. Some growers I know will roll the field after terminating the cover crop to seal in the moisture. If it's a really dry year, it'll reduce the evaporation from the soil, kind of break that evaporative pathway up. And help keep that moisture in there so the cover crop can break down. But if you're terminating early and there's more rain in the forecast, you don't want to do that because then it affects your infiltration. So I think, again, being a little bit nuanced in your approach as much as you can with termination. Sometimes you might just be like, I got to get this out of the ground. I got to plant, and I can't be too particular. And that's a reality as well. But, I think talking to other growers who have done it, and thinking about really watching the weather as for as much of a forecast as there is out there, thinking about the equipment that you have and conserving that soil moisture for your cash crop is critical. And the water benefits come with cover crops for sure.
I think both of your answers were a great illustration of how nuanced and complex the practice can really be. There are so many different ways to cover crop. But Emily, I want to get your voice back in this conversation, because I know CAF, is doing a lot of work with growers on cover cropping as well. And so I was wondering, since you're also working directly with farmers, can you tell us something about what you're seeing? Even what are some of the challenges that farmers might be coming up against with implementing cover crops that you're seeing and working to help address?
Yeah, I think that aside from, especially when starting out, from figuring out the basics, like, what to plant, how to terminate, et cetera, and when to terminate, which Sarah and Tom have highlighted as well. I think there's a couple of other challenges that we see come up, sometimes commonly or from time to time. So yeah, one operational challenge, especially for folks who are starting out, might be accessing proper equipment. This is something we hear fairly often for folks who are getting started. So, for example, a no-till drill, which is a really excellent piece of equipment for planting cover crop, but it is specialized and it is quite expensive. So it can be a real, financial investment for folks, especially who are small to mid-scale growers, especially. So access to equipment can be an issue, and I think that's where efforts like the tool sharing or the equipment sharing program that is underway in California can help out, that I know CDFA is part of, and Cooperative Extension in the RCDs. So I think that's a valuable, kind of lever to help alleviate barrier to entry of equipment access. And then of course there's other ways to plant as well, like broadcasting, or if you have access to like a grain drill, those are other options as well. And I think on the economic or financial side of things, in tight years where commodity prices are especially low, cover cropping, understandably might not be the highest priority for growers, understandably. And for folks who are just trying to get by that year, they might not have that financial margin to put toward cover crop seeding, and if there are any additional passes. So for example, we've seen folks who have done cover cropping in the past, like a walnut grower comes to mind who had done cover cropping and had been successful with it. And then a couple years back when the walnut market hit bottom, they elected not to cover crop that year because things were just so tight financially. And yeah, I think that's where programs like cost share and incentive programs, like healthy soils or NRCS or Seeds for Bees can help alleviate that financial barrier. And can, from what we've heard in talking to some of these growers as part of the interviews we did with motivators and barriers, we did hear from a number of folks that those incentive programs really made a difference in some years between, doing a practice like cover cropping or not in specific years. And then also I would say, yeah, potentially also if you're able to, just selecting like a lower price or maybe simpler cover crop mix that year if commodity prices or other external costs or pressures are higher. Let's see. I think also rodents is in terms of pressure is a more common one. Doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to happen, but cover crop does provide a nice habitat and forage for gophers and voles especially. And I think we've heard some folks have good success with owl boxes. Often some degree of tillage can be needed if rodent pressure really gets high, which unfortunately it has been in a lot of the Central Valley and much of California, really. Yeah, and then on top of that, just staying on top of your pest control for rodents and monitoring too. And then Sarah Light alluded to this to frost damage. Is like a common question or concern, especially in late winter, early spring, around bud break, especially. And yeah, I would say there's this perception and sometimes also real risk of a higher risk of frost damage with cover crops in perennial systems. And this can be managed with like a low mow, or if you have livestock and you're able to get in there doing a grazing prior to that freeze. And then I think Sarah mentioned also irrigation prior to freeze can help mitigate frost risk. I've also heard some folks like to mow alternate rows in orchards or vineyards, which can help with air circulation, but I don't know what the status of like the research is on that specific method. And in terms of the water picture specifically, I might bounce this to Kristen, but I think like just generally in certain regions, yeah, depending on the GSA, it can be complicated. So some GSAs under Sigma, so the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, in the way that they account for cover cropping, they kind of tend to treat it in most cases as a net sink for water. So I think there's just a lot of education that needs to be done because we do know based on recent research and like a growing body of research that cover crops really use a negligible amount of extra water. I think recent research in like almonds and tomatoes across the Sac and San Joaquin Valley shows it's less than or up to 2 inches or less than 2 inches. But so yeah, quite low really.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So, just to that Sigma point, we know, the allocations and Sigma in general, the pumping restrictions, seem to uh, you know, potentially be something that could deter grower adoption of practices like cover crops or hedgerows due to their additional water use, as you mentioned. And um, I completely agree with you that this is an area there's a lot of research coming out. And one thing that sustainable conservation is really excited about continuing to do, as we did with the cover crops in the Sigma era white paper, is to be able to make sure that that information and that research gets out to the folks who need it. So we are continuing to do outreach to GSAs, and other folks, and trying to help make that point. Well, we're getting toward the end here, so I think I'm hoping that we can end on some success stories, and wondering if you all could just say a couple things about, what you're seeing folks do that has been successful. Maybe talk about some of the farmers you're working with. Right. How about you, Emily?
I think just, I guess to keep it brief, we do know a handful of farmers who run sheep through their orchards or vineyards to graze their cover crop and help manage it or even terminate it. And I would say that's a really nice way to stack like different kind of functions there. And folks seem to see, like cumulative benefits the more seasons that they do that. Sometimes with pest control, weed suppression, I think there's like a really great synergy there with nutrient cycling, especially nitrogen cycling too. And one farm that comes to mind that we've worked with is Machado Family Farms in the Linden area. They've had a lot of success with running sheep in their walnuts to manage their cover crops, and I've heard that they have seen reduced pest pressure. They've been able to eliminate some sprays. And then also in terms of water use, I believe also being able to have like a later first irrigation in the spring, as well as being able to extend, the time between irrigation sets due to the soil health benefits that they've seen. Even after, the cover crop has been terminated and into the summer. And then I think also kind of echoing what Sarah shared, I think just having an attitude and mindset of curiosity and like being open to looking at things, or rather, I think to also looking at how to measure specific things. Sometimes I've noticed like growers who can measure their soil moisture improvements across time, or maybe even doing something like leaf sap analysis and seeing how that's changed. Seems like having some of those tools can be like really validating for growers to see the improvements that they're making. But I do think like observational kind of improvements can be valid too. And then, yeah, I think also just often there's some trial and error to dial in like your planting and your mix and termination. So generally having an attitude of accepting that there's going to be some trial and error is really helpful. And I think also this is where like trialing a portion of your land, like doing a block or part of a block if you're just starting out with cover crops, can be useful too. And we've seen folks do that and then kind of dial things in and be able to scale up from there as well.
Tom, do you have anything to add to that?
I'm going to try and cap this thing off. I like rules of thumb. They're real easy to deal with, and a lot of people can understand them. So I'm going to say, if you're going to start cover cropping or you are cover cropping and you're working your way through it, there's 4 P's to come about. There's planning, preparation, patience, and persistence. The planning is, yeah, you're adding another practice to your current practice if you haven't done it before. And you need to know kind of what you want out of it, what plant you're going to use. Your preparation is having those inputs, having that cover crop seed and the tools and everything else you're going to need to know. A good calendar says, okay, well, I gotta have it dead by so and so time. Patience, you're improving soil. What was it? 6 inches deep by 1 acre, over 1 million pounds. So moving the needle on that's going to take some time. There's a lot of times we see a big improvement the first year, but by the third year is when we really start to see more stuff happening. And the persistence is the growers that take the time, do it right, and continue to do it. are the ones that will see the biggest changes happen for them. So yeah, that 3 years is kind of the magic number, 3 to 5 years. And the other thing to remember is that no 2 years are ever the same. So what worked last year is probably going to work this year, but it may not look exactly the same.
All right, that is a great note for us to end on. Um, Tom, Sarah, Emily, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate all the insights and wisdom you've shared with us. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks. All right. Thanks everyone for hanging with us through the recording. It looks like we have the grower guidance QR code here up on the screen. If you didn't catch the link for that earlier, want to give everyone a second to access that. And then we have Emily and Tom here with us to answer some additional questions. So there's still some time to put questions into the chat. If you have any questions that came up during the recording. And if not, I have a couple that I can throw out there. So why don't I get us started? And if anyone here with us live has any questions they want to add, feel free to do that. Um, so maybe we can just start off with some additional resources, Emily and Tom, that you might have to share with us. So, CAF and also Seeds for Bees is doing a lot of this work in terms of creating resources and guidance for growers. And this would be a good time to share some additional things in the chat. But maybe Emily, do you want to start off and share some of the other cover cropping resources that you have?
Mhm. Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So we do have a number of resources that we've compiled from other folks who've, put together resources and as well as things that we have put together at CAF as well. And I can pop that in the chat. So we have on our CAF website ecological farming resources that are specific to cover crops. And so at this link, you can find our cover crop decision guide for annual cropping systems. So it has some considerations. It's not so much of a lens of water scarcity like the guide that we've been featuring, although I think there's some elements of that incorporated. But yeah, some just considerations around planting and timing, things that were, I think, outlined in our conversation here today as well. And then also you can find a guide that is focused on perennial systems, so like orchards and whatnot, vineyards as well. And let's see, I think also we have some other resources that I can pop in the chat too. I should mention those guides are also in English and Spanish if that's useful for folks. Um, Also, yeah, under that link, you can find there's a relatively new cost and benefits of cover crop in walnuts. Yeah, guidance or kind of document that was put together somewhat recently. I think Tom's actually featured in that too to provide some expertise there. But we also have a couple of grower stories and kind of outline some of the benefits, costs and benefits that these growers have seen, as well as specific financial costs around cover crops. So that might be helpful in some contexts. And then also, I'm going to share, we have our ecological farming resources too around livestock integration, just if that's of interest to folks too. That'll be popping in the chat here. And yeah, like different case studies that we have. We have a case study on integrating sheep in walnuts. We have a best management practices guide around sheep in vineyards. So, I think for some folks who are kind of doing things in a holistic way with livestock integration, sorry, and cover cropping, that can be useful too. And yeah, I think those are the main things that I would highlight.
Great, thanks, Emily. And then Tom, I know Seeds for Bees has some opportunities available right now for growers. I see you put the link in the chat, but do you want to talk for a moment about that?
Yeah, the Seeds for Bees program was originated as a cooperation between beekeepers who are the backbone of Project Apis M and some growers in Northern California. And basically, the idea was to provide forage for honeybees early in the season. That's very important to beekeepers. And at the same time, we get a soil health benefit of having a cover crop out there. So it was kind of like, okay, we'll make this work type of thing. Seeds for Bees offers a seed incentive or a seed availability that's kind of unique in the United States from what I can find out here. Basically, we will supply you with seed and try and help you find somebody to get it in the ground for you, or help hold your hand a little bit to get it done on that type of thing. Um, we will and it's a 2 year subsidized program. By the third year, basically, you can continue to buy it through that program, or we'll find you somebody that can or get you launched. The idea was to get people used to doing it. First year, they'll supply $2,500 worth of seed, including shipping. Second year would be $1,500 worth of seed, including shipping. Third year, yeah, you could purchase it at our price, or well, like I said, we'll find you somebody, or you by that time you've probably done it 2 years now. It's yeah, okay, I like this, but I don't like that part of it, and then we can go however it wants to go, finding you what will work for you type of thing. We offer um, materials that do support honeybees more so than anything else. So there's a brassica mix, which would be mustards, radish, and a small grain type of thing. Great for water infiltration improvement. If we can get it established early enough in the fall, it's flowering the same time the almonds are, so the bees have extra forage. They stay in the orchard, etc. We also offer a more traditional biomass mix that's got brassicas in it, vetch in it, and a small grain that will basically work more so for water infiltration improvement and soil and general soil improvement, um, but also has that pollinator forage component to it. And like I said, it's an application process. The window's open right now, and if you go on to projectapism.org, there's a tab over there someplace that says Seeds for Bees. You follow that down there, it runs into an application. The applications come in, we'll pick them up. Then we play contact with you, figure out how much you need, where it's going, and all that fun stuff, and go from there. And then basically, seed would arrive in the late summer, early fall, for you to get planted.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So great compliment to some of the other incentive programs like the Healthy Soils program. Great resources. Um,
Sarah,
let's see.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
pop in
go
the
ahead.
chat another resource that came to mind. So we put together cover crop seeding and equipment calibration video, also featuring Tom, from a couple years ago. And this is for a no-till Great Plains seeder. So yeah, just some specific info there if that is helpful for folks too.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Tom, you're involved in everything. I'm kidding.
Up
The,
to about here, yeah.
the impression.
And actually, in this situation, Emily and I and several other organizations are working on trying to consolidate a list of custom planters. As
Great.
as Emily alluded to, the equipment's expensive to do it right.
Yeah.
So if you can find someone else who'll come and do it for a fee versus you having to buy the piece of equipment that now sits around for 51 weeks of the year, um, that might be the way to go. The hard part is finding people that will do it year after year after year and are available, because everybody wants to do it all at once. So it's kind of a jammed in rush. So it's a bit of scheduling. So we will also basically, when we're doing some of that advising on that thing, is like, okay, guys, reach out to these people early and get them lined up so that they're there when you need them to be there, not necessarily you're calling them on Friday night to come plant Saturday morning because they're not going to answer the phone.
Great. Yeah, thanks for sharing those. Yeah, the equipment piece seems really important. Let's see. Maybe since we have a couple more minutes, I'll take us to um a couple maybe specific questions. Tom, during the webinar, you referred to cover crop mixes as an insurance policy, and I think that's something that kind of stands out. Can you talk a little bit more about that in the context of like water scarcity or water variability with winter precipitation or the timing of precipitation and how valuable maybe a mix might be in that context?
I think a mix, um, and I could tie this to termination timing, I guess, is the best way,
Yeah.
one of the best ways to do it because that's kind of the trigger for when people decide they want to terminate is if you have a mix that has something that is early to mature and it also has things that are mature later than that or reach maximum biomass later than that. And you're going to base your termination date on something in that mix heading out because that's about when you want to start working on trying to take it down. If it's early, then basically when that's at that point, you're going to terminate it. Some of it might actually grow back if we get a little more rain and you didn't disc it in. This would be in vineyards and some trees. Um, and if it was raining when you were expecting to do that, the later on ones are going to overcome and produce that much more biomass. So the biomass is the engine that we're feeding the soil with. So it's having a mix in there is also if it's more so of a nuance in things when we're using legumes, especially small seeded legumes, a lot of times, is some really prefer acid soil and some will deal with an alkaline soil better than others. And I remember seeing it on hillsides, whereas you had lots of one thing at the top and lots of something else at the bottom.
Yeah.
You'd had just one thing in there that was at the top of the hill. At the bottom of the hill, it'd be either scraggly or it wouldn't have been real happy about it. In forage mixes, we would put in some annual ryegrass to take care of those flooded spots. There would still be something in that flooded spot when everything else drowned. But if it
Mm,
rained so much, it still grew in there. It was still worthwhile to have it. It was just that was your insurance policy against unforeseen disasters. So
yeah.
on something in a dry climate, yeah, we might look at something that's going to mature as early as possible. That way we're not, in the mindset, we're not sucking up extra water out of the soil. It's time to kill it. So pull the trigger and be done with it.
Great, thanks. Well, we are almost out of time here. Maybe this is a good moment for me to share that um, we are also in the process of developing some additional guidance and fact sheets around other specific uses of cover crops. So we have one that'll be coming out around extended cover cropping in perennial systems, another one about cover cropping in annual systems, and then the last one will be about using vegetative cover in multi-benefit land repurposing. So keep your eye out for those. They should be coming out in the next couple of months for certain. But otherwise, I want to thank everyone for joining us here today. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to Emily, Tom, or Sarah, or myself. Our information is on the screen. And we'd really like to just thank CDFA's Office of Resilience and Sustainability for their support in this webinar and the production of these guidance documents. So with that, thanks and happy Healthy Soils Week, everyone.